We're going to have, it's been a delight to have Padraig here this week, and we've worked him hard, as anybody who's looked at the schedule knows. Wednesday evening, we had a conversation right here with Greg Boyle as well, and then Thursday he was signing books out at Novel. So if you go out to Novel and if you don't have his most recent book, you can get one. He's already pinned if you miss him today. And then Friday he preached at noon, and then Saturday we had just a delightful time with 80 people that Catherine put together a retreat with Padraig out at St. Columba, where we learned how to write collects, and anyway, just a delightful week. So thank you for your time and your wonderful energy. So we just have a couple of poems, I think, that of Padraig's own that we want to spend some time with together and with you. And I only have a general sense as to where we might be going with this morning, and how we might want to walk through these. How would you like to start?
Good morning, and Scott, it's lovely to have been here, and it's very nice to have met so many of whom I'd met last year as well. It's nice to see you again, and nice to see my host for the meal on Friday night as well. Thank you so much. So yeah, lovely to be with you all. When you said wilderness, like one of my favorite texts in the Gospels is the accounts that you find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke about Jesus of Nazareth being driven out into the desert, into the wilderness. The word in Greek is the same, wilderness, desert. It just depends as to what translation you read, as to how that's rendered into English. But the word is the same. So whenever you mentioned wilderness, I thought of a poem about wilderness that I could look at, and the devil as well.
Yeah.
Will I say a bit about it? And then,
say a bit about it, and then we can read it.
There's an artist in Britain called Cy Smith, S-I. His name, I'm guessing his name's Simon or Simeon, and he's a cartoonist, and so he had done this series called 40, and it was 40 images of Jesus of Nazareth in the desert, all cartoons, all still cartoons in mostly grey tones. And so at the start, he's there, and he's seems to be pretty happy. Hello, you're welcome. I'm just talking a bit about the story of Jesus of Nazareth in the desert, in the wilderness. And so at the start of this series of art pieces, Jesus of Nazareth is there, and he looks okay. You know, he's sleeping, he's praying. In one of the early ones, because there's 40 of them, one of the early ones, he's cartwheeling, he's bored, and as time goes on, he looks more haggard. Of course, he's not eating or sleeping. He's not eating or drinking, apparently, for those days. I do love, I can't remember, I think it's in the Gospel of Mark, it says, and at the end of 40 days, he was hungry. My God, I'd be hungry after 40 minutes. So sometimes the Gospels are filled with ridiculous kinds of detail. When Jesus of Nazareth goes up to the mountain of transfiguration, it says that his clothes go whiter than any bleach could make them. And you kind of feel like it's product placement for transfiguration washing powder, So anyway, so this beautiful series of sketches, grey tone sketches, and then just towards the end, the tempter comes in. And what I think is brilliant, absolutely brilliant, theologically pristine, is that the tempter doesn't turn up, with kind of goat feet and horns and a tail and big leathery wings. He looks just like Jesus. In fact, he is Jesus. A little bit more translucent. You can see through him. But he is Jesus. And so you see Jesus of Nazareth in conversation with himself. And theologically, I think and psychologically, I think it's utterly brilliant. Because the questions he's asking himself in this is, can I find a faster way through? Should I just end it all? And what about power? And it's like if the devil turned up inside here, we'd all be like, hey, check it out, there's the Lucifer, with fiery breath and wings or whatever, we'd all just kind of go, great. That's easy, Temptation is something that you actually want to do, and for which there might be good reason to consider. And so therefore, it's conversation with yourself is much more difficult. And that, I think, is what the place of wilderness is. And I think it's one of the wisdoms of that tradition is that to go to the wilderness, it's easy to think you'll face the devil, but that's ignorable. You won't. You'll face yourself. That's not ignorable, and that's difficult. And yeah, I have no interest in heroin. If somebody came up to me right now and said, "Do you want some heroin?" I'd say, "No, thanks." Maybe Scott wants some. I don't know. You're good too. But there are things that do tempt me, and therefore to think about temptation and wilderness, you're only tempted by what you're actually tempted by, and you're only in conversation with something that seems just like you, and that I think is a much more demanding understanding of the wilderness than anything that's kind of got the fantastical drama of the actual devil.
Yeah.
So anyway, here is a poem called Wild, and this is there's a little epigraph on it. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And the word devil there, I think it's pyrio in Greek, means the accuser. I think that's the word that Matthew uses. And this is a sonnet. Because you too struggled, you went into the wild with nothing to shield you from the light. You learned to shade your eyes from the sun. You sweated in your sleep in the heat of the day. You made up stories to waste time and to keep the fear away. It didn't work. You wrestled with a devil more subtle than the one you'd read about. He didn't lurk in the corner of your cave or scream at you with a night blue mouth. He didn't roast you or launch himself out at you, all bat wings and hooves. He was always with you. But you didn't see that till the end. You'd been worrying about food and flight and fancy and how to be who you were. You'd been worrying about prayer and the way a man should care for his country when his country's a plaything for a despot. You'd been worrying about thirst and endings. You feared death, not fear, but both made you feel like a failure. One brutal, final, the other goes on forever. Just like you and the devil I see through you.
I mean, I kind of want to walk through it, right?
Yeah.
That the first stanza, the first thing I wondered about, because you too struggled, because you also struggled, you went into the wild with nothing to shield you from the light. And I read that a few times. I don't know if you all did. You're explaining, or you're suggesting a reason why he went into the wild, or is it because why he went into the wild unprotected? Does that make sense? Why he went at all, or why he actually specifically?
Well, both. Yeah, I mean, struggles often remove the things that you feel raw when you struggle, don't you? You feel exposed, and so therefore, sometimes it's not even a choice when you're struggling. You sometimes feel like everything that you had around you that could feel like a protection is gone, and so you feel exposed. The Hebrew word for exile, one of the Hebrew words for exile is gala, and it means naked. And so there's something really interesting about that, about feeling naked in exile. And so while this isn't a word looking at exile, I do think that the sense of having nothing to shield you is there. And also because he struggled, and struggle, I think, asks for your attention. That's one of the things it is it's a demand for attention.
Sure. And then you say you learned to shade your eyes from the sun, which is interesting. You walk in there and the thing that we would assume would be instinct. He's actually even just learning.
Yeah, I don't know why I put that there. Yeah, but I mean, I'm leaving it there, but I don't know. It's
I have to defend it.
Yeah, I don't know why it is. I mean, why wouldn't he know how to shade his eyes? But partly it's continuing on with the light that so often we spoke about this the other day, or was it yesterday? I can't remember. That the implication is often that struggle is associated with darkness, and that, this isn't 40 nights in the dark. He didn't go to the North Pole in winter. This is, and I always think of the light, the bleaching light of the desert and the wilderness. And so in a certain sense, I wanted to put it out there that this was a place where you could see, and a place where the light itself was part of the oppression, the exposure, rather than automatically assuming night is struggle and day is lovely,
Yeah, and that blindness is a metaphor for stupidity, as you mentioned your friend said. Well, to me, it also just, you just said naked. There's a sense of going into this unprotected and naked, and even learning how to, he hadn't even learned how to protect himself, is added a layer to that to me.
And I suppose that's a quiet way of, talking about what does it mean to protect yourself from God, if you believe in God. Like, what does it mean to think that the very thing that you're trying to follow itself causes some suffering? The vocation even that asks something of you can break you. And the wilderness is a place where you experience that and you face that. I'm not sure the wilderness is a place where you come back with a strategic plan to go, great, I know what I'm doing. I think you come back having had a gut experience that might be something that can be of nurture, or you've been broken in a new way. That's what I mean by wilderness. Yeah.
Well, then he's sweating in his sleep in the heat of the day, which seems natural. It seems like he would be.
Yeah, where would you sleep?
There.
Yeah, it's like that unquiet sleep when it's too hot. I mean, you know that. I mean, I'm Irish. What do I know about heat? God almighty.
And the last line, I don't know if it struck any of you. Now I'm imagining Jesus sweating through his night, struggling out in the wild. You made up stories to waste time and to keep the fear away. I don't know if I imposed this on it, but I'm suddenly imagining the stories that we know Jesus for. Coming from this moment of emptiness and idleness, he's saying, I'm going to make up some stories to keep myself entertained because there's nobody around. Yeah. And to keep the fear away. Yeah. Telling stories to keep the fear away. How are those related?
Well, stories are a way, I think, where you can project yourself into characters, and half the time the stories that you can make up are stories where you fragment yourself, and so you become different parts of yourself. I mean, that's a kind of a Jungian imagination of a dream. Jung imagines that in the dream that you are every part of the dream. So if you have a dream about your sibling and your cousin and your teacher and a car and yourself, you are all of those, including the car, and your unconscious has just put bits of itself there. And the invitation in a dream, a serious dream, is to think, well, what would the cousin and the sibling and the teacher and the car and the me of the dream, what would they say to each other? And so I think that's just another way of understanding story, that somehow people make up stories and they all come from themselves, and there's a little bit of you in all of the stories. And so like the prodigal son, for instance, not that the prodigal son is in Matthew, but this imagination of a father and two sons, and resentful. Like, was Jesus of Nazareth thinking about a brother of his? Was this a reflection on a story of his own life? Was he thinking about his awkward leaving of his family with this determined, demanding sense of vocation? So how is that dream of a story some kind of reflection back about his own unconscious? That interests me. And for me, this is for any poetry nerds in the room. I hope to God there's at least one of you. I'm very interested in line length. So for me, you made up stories to waste time and to keep the fear away. It didn't work. And I'm very interested in the percussion of a long line followed by a short line. And for me, so much of poetry is sound and image altogether. So it didn't work. That is brutal, because the fear didn't stay away. And that's what I'm trying to say. The fear can come back even through the stories. But it's also a bit of melody, just for any of you who like a little bit about poetry.
Yeah, there's space. There's physical space between.
Yeah.
Trying to keep the fear away, and then it didn't work. So I was reading these this morning when you sent them, and the story, we try to make sense of things too with story. We try to pull the chaos into something. It reminded me of this. I'm going to pitch this out here. Reynolds Price, do you know Reynolds Price, a Southern writer? This is what he said at the beginning of one of his books on the gospel. Reynolds Price has some paraphrases of the Gospels. He also has novels, and anyway. This is what he said. It stuck with me. A need to hear and tell stories is essential to the species Homo sapiens. Second in necessity, apparently after nourishment and before love and shelter. Millions survive without love or home, almost none in silence. The opposite of silence leads quickly to narrative, and the sound of story is the dominant sound of our lives, from the small accounts of our days, events, to the vast, incommunicable constructs of psychopaths. It came back to mind because I'm thinking even Jesus struggling in this wilderness and chaos to say, I'm going to start constructing, I want to make this into story somehow.
And there's the irony that the construction of a story usually happens in response to the fragmenting of self. And I think, therefore, what we do as we fall apart is to find art. Not that holds us together. Art isn't a glue. Art doesn't have that function. But sometimes art just allows you to say, yeah, this is what it feels like. And so you might make art that feels like it's broken. And it's not trying to say it's all fine or it's all going to be okay in the end. We don't know. But somehow just art that can reflect your own anarchy back to you, art that can reflect the dystopia you're living in, has something to say. I'm always interested in art that comes from places of conflict. There's a great new collection called Words for War, which is contemporary poetry from Ukraine translated into English. It's about 7 or 8 contemporary poets there, and it's just so interesting to read poems about flowers, about waiting for spring, about gunshot, about listening to news on the radio. Do you know, it's just so, and the overlapping of all of them. And you know, you don't have to write war poems in a place of war. You can write flower poems, and to allow all these things to be present, all as part of a response to art, I think it's one of the things that interests me about the role of art.
If you missed Padraig's sermon on Friday, we had creation and the power of art, and art reflecting back, or the creation reflecting back on, looking back at the artist, the divine artist, or us. Let's move on through this. Y'all jump in if you want. This is the second. Okay, it didn't work. He goes off when it's in a struggle. He's off struggling, learning to shade his eyes, sweating, making up stories to keep the fear away, and to waste time and keep the fear. It didn't work. Now the devil shows up. We got a little primer on the devil, and as you were talking earlier, I want you to say some more. It struck me that the way we talk about perfection in Jesus and the way we construct a really conspicuous devil, suddenly as you were talking, this is what we do now, right?
Yeah. We
have very conspicuous devils in the world. I don't know who you like or vote for or don't vote for, but I'm guessing your devils are very vivid. And you know their names, you know what they look like, you know where they show up. But this one was more subtle than the one we'd read about.
Yeah.
Say something about that.
Partly this second stanza is an enjoyable sound of play. This is an exercise in poetics for me. Like, you wrestled with a devil more subtle than the one you'd read about. He didn't lurk in the corner of your cave or scream at you with a night blue mouth. He didn't roast you or launch himself out at you, all bat wings and hooves. And so I enjoyed the play of language in that. It's one of my favorite stanzas that I've written, actually, this one. I like the play of subtle and lurk. They're very imperfect rhymes, but there's an echo of that there. And night blue as well. When I was younger, I was fascinated by the devil. I begged my parents for a Bible, and when I was 8, and they got me a children's Bible, I still have it. And the first thing I did was to look through to see was there a devil in it. And the devil, I can tell you for a fact, is the same color as your top, this sky blue, with fiery red eyes and a convenient long tail and a pitchfork. It was a great depiction of the devil, and I was fascinated by it. A few years later, I began to hear that gay people were demonized or whatever, and there was a small exorcism when I was 12. Then there was 3 big exorcisms when I was 18 for getting rid of the gay devils. And I spent a lot of time being oppressed by people's imagination of the devil. And so this poem is in a long conversation with the idea to say that which is called the devil is not the devil. Often it is those who speak about the devil are doing the work of the devil. And so there's a way within which concepts like God and the devil or heaven and hell, I'm always interested in who's speaking rather than what they say they're speaking about. Those are just distractions. God's just a distraction. So is the devil. So is heaven. So is hell. All we know is we're here and we're talking to each other, and somebody's being a bastard to you. And so that's what interests me, is how is it that language can be turned to attune us towards each other. I'm uninterested in the question of the afterlife. I'm really interested in the question of this life, and what can we do in the quality of this life with art, with integrity, with truth, to speak to each other. And this is Jesus' attention being turned away from the fantastical toward this. And so the way this stanza ends, he was always with you, but you didn't see that to the end. The stanza break there is a way within which I'm showing myself, but also showing him that he is concerned with the question of, that he is depicted as a character who grows in his imagination. Often it seems to me that the stories about Jesus of Nazareth are profoundly boring, because he just arrives down, knows everything, can do everything, Superman, that's a very boring character. But I don't even think that the Gospels believe that, because it says that when the Gospel of Luke says that when he got lost when he was 12, he was strange to his parents. And then it said they took him back and he grew in wisdom and favor. So he had to grow. So even the Gospels, there's this tiny question, this tiny little implication there to say, yeah, he had things to learn. And I like that quiet, surreptitious challenge to the idea of Jesus of Nazareth as the God puppet present there in that little tiny aside. So I'm interested in Jesus of Nazareth as a human character.
So I want to linger just a little longer with the devil, because you've shown me something. So Milton famously, his devil was Satan was much more interesting than any of their characters, the Milton scholars will tell us. You've just actually written one of your favorite quatrains that's very vivid in telling us what the devil is not.
Yeah.
It's very vivid. And I just wonder about the work maybe it's doing. If something that's drawn out of you and Milton, you and your buddy Milton, that draws this creativity in putting flesh and bones and hooves and wings on the thing that has haunted us.
Yeah.
There must be something going on there, important.
Yeah, well, we've always demonized, haven't we? You know this yourself. Somebody, even someone close to you who hurts you, you can suddenly turn them into something terrible. That they spend all their day plotting against you. They become this devil, that they wake up in the morning and think, how can I hurt this person? And the arguments you have in your head turn them into somebody who has done this deliberately. And so the psychological function of demonization is very, very powerful. So it's convenient to have an actual character who lives in hell, who kind of pops up every now and then and has some agenda against you. That's very convenient, but it doesn't serve the purposes of maturity, I don't think. I do like night blue. I like these are called contractions when you put two words together. So like German is filled with contractions. Where you can put, 20 words together and have very, very long words. Some of you probably speak German, but I do like night blue. Bat wings and hooves.
And you just said the devil was blue from Duke?
That's where it came from. Yeah. That is where it came from. That's why I put blue in there. Yeah. And blue and hooves as well. Irish poetry is often built on assonance, so elongated vowel sounds that repeat themselves without particular beats. They're not in iambs the way that you'd get it in certain poems. There's kind of a sense of like a stream going down a hill. There's a synchronicity to it, but it moderates in a certain sense because there's a turn or there's a boulder or something. And so, Irish poetry is, Yeats called it the Irish mode, so it's about building up rhyme through elongated vowel sounds. So you can hear that. You wrestle, let's just listen to the vowel sounds. You wrestled with a devil more subtle than the one you'd read about. He didn't lurk in the corner of your cave or scream at you with a night blue mouth. He didn't roast you or launch himself out at you all bat wings and hooves. He was always with you, but you didn't see that till the end. And so you, and then there's a way within which the vowel sounds drop off. Didn't see that till the end. So that's where it feels, I'm looking for the psychological experience of feeling of a line changing and moving like that. So.
Embedded there is he didn't know quite what was going on until the end. Is it the very end, or is it the end of the temptation?
The end of the temptation,
Yeah.
here, this is, till the end of the time in the wilderness.
He'd been worrying about food and flight and fancy and how to be who you were, worrying about prayer and the way a man should care. There's the internal rhymes you have there. For his country, when his country is a plaything for a despot, worrying about thirst and endings. A lot of very specific things, but going from thirst all the way out to the empire.
Yeah, food, flight, and fancy are a way of summarizing the three temptations that the accuser brings to Jesus of Nazareth. Eat this, jump off the cliff, or bow down and I'll give you everything. Food, flight, and fancy. So again, there's a little bit of alliteration. That's a summary, really, of those three. I am always struck with the flight one. If you give me the possibility of a superpower, flight is the absolute one. I always want to fly. But I think there's lurking in that is a fascinating thing. That, like, how did this story come into being? This story that when Jesus of Nazareth went into the wilderness, he faced something of himself that was a serious struggle. How did that come into being? He must have told his friends, I faced something there. Whatever that was, I faced it. And it's very interesting to think about that. And so I wonder what those conversations were. And the way that he kind of fancied it up by saying the devil arrived, instead of going, I saw me. And hidden in it is that he came to the edge of himself to think, will I throw myself off a cliff? Looking at the potential he had, that he too came to the edge of something there. And in the middle of the fantastical nature of it all, he was saying something like, I wondered about myself. Can I cope with myself? And that, I think, is a quiet vulnerability present in this major character, which interests me, that he wondered about power, and he wondered about endings, and he wondered about hunger. And to look at those three primary motivators, can I go on? Will I be amazing? What will nurture me? Those are profound crises of an individual's life that you face by yourself. So, and then worrying about prayer and the way a man should care for his country when his country is a plaything for a despot. I am particularly thinking of Herod, particularly of Herod in this context, because Herod is a major character in Matthew in terms of that. And Herod was terrible. Herod was just, oh my God, chaos upon chaos upon chaos. Or the Herods, there were multiples of them. They were total chaos. And they just treated people willy-nilly according for their own to their own desire for promotion and power, And then, of course, they were just appointed under the Roman Empire, and whoever was the emperor or the procurator in terms of Pilate. You just look at ways within which a country can be played. And there was also various things happening in various countries while I was working on this, regarding people who have been appointing despots. And I'm not thinking only of one, I'm thinking of many in different countries who've been appointing despots. So for me, this is a contemporary question. How do I care for my country when my country is a plaything for a despot? How do you? How does anybody?
And then you feared death, not fear. But both made you feel like a failure. Take us through the end. That's really poignant to me, that he feared death, but not fear, but maybe he should have.
Yeah, I know. Partly this comes from, like, what is it? So there's a phrase in Irish, the way in English you can say, just in case. So you might go, I have to be up early in the morning for a flight, so I've set 2 alarms, just in case. In England, they'll say, when somebody says that, I've set 2 alarms, they have this phrase in England, belt and braces. Braces, do you call them the same thing for holding your trousers up? Suspenders, yeah. There's the alliteration in belt and braces, which, I think psychoanalytically, it's all based on the idea of your pants falling down. It's based on that idea to say, just to make sure that my ass isn't going to be exposed, belt and braces, and it's all about exposure. And so in Irish, the way you say that is eragla na hagla, which means upon the fear of fear. And I love that phrase, upon the fear of fear. Because often it isn't just that we're frightened of the fear. And for me, this final couplet is an exploration about what are you really frightened of. I don't think it quite makes sense, but it's not meant to, because the realm between death and fear, how do we know what one is and what one isn't? Where does one start? Where does one end? Both made you feel like a failure. One brutal, final, the other goes on forever. To my mind, the brutality and finality of death is just one thing. Fear can continue to grow. Fear is a fire that burns upon a fire. Fear is a cancer, something that lives on itself and causes death by not knowing its own death. So that's part of the exposure of that.
Oh, we got to get to the other one. And the devil I see through you.
Well, I suppose I wanted to redeem the language of devil. I mean, people do violent, terrible things. I'm uninterested in redeeming that. But I am interested in terms of a literary approach to just look at the functional literature of the word devil and to see it as a mirror. And rather than thinking, oh my God, cast that thing out, or whatever it is that people have in the imagination, I'm bored also by stories that just have a big bad wolf, I'm totally bored in films or TV or books where there's somebody who just comes in and all they are is evil, evil, evil. Fine, whatever. Like, I probably just won't watch the film. I just find it boring. I don't find it artistically stimulating. I'm interested in something where I can see. I have another sonnet where it picks up on a line from Dante's Inferno, where at the bottom in Dante's Inferno, the hell is a cone of 9 circles, and you're wondering the whole way throughout it, when are they going to meet the devil? And they do meet the devil, Dante and Virgil, when they get down to the 9th circle of hell, down at the very bottom. And the devil has huge, huge wings, causing frigid winds to blow everywhere. But the devil is frozen in a lake of his own tears, utterly impotent. And Dante says, oh, what a marvel it appeared to me when he sees this. And I'm interested in how that, in the place of seeing something, that there was marvel and wonder also. There's something really interesting even in the Inferno about that, and that hell exists even though the devil is imprisoned there. That's an interesting thing that Dante is saying within the context of the caricaturing of that, and I think that's worthwhile. Another part of my life was conflict resolution. Conflict resolution is a theater. Usually there's something very loud that's demanding attention. And I'm always, if this was the theater stage here, there'll be a loud drama happening here between me and Scott or whoever is up here. But the real question in conflict resolution is, who wrote the script? Who's making money from all you people coming here and paying to watch it? Who's the director? Who owns the building in which this is set up? What's happening behind the curtains? Who set up the stage? And so not to be distracted by the drama, but to look for something else. And the devil is a complete distraction. I'm always interested in the power and the script and the narrative when it comes to conflict. And then I want art to have that kind of quality of asking questions about power.
So there's danger in making up stories too. It was a good thing, but it's also a fraught thing. It might be a way we wield our power. Okay, let's move. Anything burning before we move on to this next poem out there? I don't want to... These are inexhaustible.
Anything burning. Nice phrase, Scott. Beside the
Anything
Irishman who's on
frozen
the
in
highway
ice?
to hell.
You read this one when we were in conversation with Brian McLaren.
With Greg.
With Greg. Wrong week. We've had so many people sitting here.
Yeah. This comes in the second one, here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is a phrase that John the Baptist says at the beginning of the Gospel of John, different John, where, that's what he says, here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Agnus Dei in Latin. And a Jewish friend of mine said to me once that he found Jesus of Nazareth really, really boring and also not very Jewish, because he said, there are no heroes in the Hebrew Bible who were perfect. has absolutely no interest in a perfect hero. And he said, Christianity has just got this obsession about purity and perfection and sinlessness in all of these characters. And he's like, but what? You know, like even the gospel that was read in the service this morning, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. You look at the sinfulness of that text and how it is that this building up of the Jews, particularly in the Gospel of John, hoi oudeia, it says in Greek. You look at the pain and the brutality of that text, and then what was done with that text in centuries that went after. It's impossible to read the Gospel of John and not pay attention to the way that how it is that phrase, the Jews, has been used over and over and over again throughout centuries to justify pogroms. And people taking a text, and you can argue to say, oh, they didn't mean it in that way. Kind of doesn't matter. Look at the text. It's there, open for interpretation and for abuse and for the usage of a justification of murder. And so that is interesting to me to therefore think, what does it mean to look at Jesus of Nazareth through the lens of kind of looking at what if all this was difficult for him? And I don't come to this believing that he was the Son of God and stepping away from a Christian affiliation in terms of doctrine. I'm very culturally Christian, of course, you know, drug up through Irish Catholicism and studied it, and very grateful for that. And my life was absolutely informed by a Christian imagination and a literary imagination of Christianity. But I'm not interested in belonging to any club or trying to assert a belief in something that is frankly bewildering. Son of God, what does that even mean? I have no idea. Died for the sins of the world? What? I have absolutely no idea about any of that. But I think he was a fascinating person. And so stepping away from demand has led to curiosity for me. And so I wanted to put words to him, informed by my friend Boris, to go, well, what would I say? Will I read it?
Say it.
So this is a sonnet as well. Here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. You weren't that perfect, weren't lamb pure or cocksure with certainty. You weren't as innocent as you're made out to be. You knew people, you knew power games, knew that the main aim of ambition is ambition. You knew the names of other people's fears because you had plenty of your own. You knew the touch of a friend was not dependent on their cleanliness, and you knew this because you knew need, knew the way that story bleeds through the actions of a day and how shame makes us play parts that are beneath us. You are beneath us and above us in the song we sang as children. You are in the piss and blood. You are spit mixed with mud. You are the rotting hand of God waiting for a hand to hold. You're not gold, you're rock. I mean, I wonder what he'd say back.
Yeah.
Should write that poem.
What's beautiful about it is it's a very incarnate poem, of course, right? It moves away from, my first favorite word is that. You weren't that perfect. Anyway,
that's interesting.
That's how I read. But anyway, you weren't that perfect. But we move away from this pristineness to bring him really into the lives we recognize.
Yeah, totally.
And then all of the details you're bringing out of the stories. He did reach out and touch the unclean. So purity didn't look what we thought purity was.
Yeah.
Perfection didn't look like what we thought perfection. All of these categories he's disrupting along the way. And I love the third section where you say how shame makes us play parts that are beneath us. And then you go to the hymn. I assume this is the hymn, Christ above us, Christ behind us, before me.
Nicely discerned. Yeah, it is.
So all of a sudden our shame takes us into this place that are beneath us, and that's where Jesus is.
Yeah.
Seems like the perfect Jesus keeps him away from the places where we need him.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I do think that Jesus of Nazareth is a fascinating character with whom to live a moral life and a moral imagination, and to have a conversation with a text that's informative. It's a morally shaping narrative is an extraordinary, necessary function. Every culture has narratives that become the moral normative narrative for not that it says to you this is how you should live. Some of them do, but even in moving away from it, that too is a moral action. My fantasy children, so I have very convenient fantasy children who are present, I would want to, and so I say this with kind of hyperbole because what do I know, but I would want to bring my children up Catholic, because I think if one of the great things about growing up in a religious framework is a really good reason to leave it, and that knowing why you're leaving is a fantastic thing, because you go, here's why. Here's where this was insufficient for me. Nothing's sufficient. Every poem fails. And so knowing why a poem fails is itself a knowledge about what a poem was trying to do. And so I don't look to a text to be sufficient. I know the Bible very well. I have 3 degrees in it, and I'll continue to study it. Like I find it fascinating. My life is in deep, everyday conversation with this text, but I am not dominated by it. I like my own independence, and I like knowing the text well enough to fight back. And I can only fight when I know it. And I also want to be undone by it. I want to see a text and go, I'm called into something of change here. I want to exhibit that kind of courage. Yeah.
Well, I heard recently that struggle is not a deficiency.
Yeah.
Struggle's a high calling.
Sure. So lamb pure or cocksure with certainty, again, you can just hear the playing around with pure and sure. But I also, speaking about cocksure, I am interested in thinking about what is the physicality of Jesus of Nazareth's body, and wanting to put in cocksure there is just a way to say we can talk about this in a way where it's okay to put it in. Mm-hmm. And then people, power games, ambition, and fears and people. And the touch of a friend was not dependent on their cleanliness. Like there's this deep psychological understanding that you see in the gospel texts of taint. Who is it that association with whom taints you? And it can feel like a very old word to talk about being tainted by association with someone. But, it's very powerful. You think of the 80s and the AIDS crisis, and what it was. I remember hearing somebody once talking about how people felt about his toothbrush because they knew that he lived with HIV. And looking at his toothbrush as if it was going to explode and share HIV everywhere. You heard that in the early days of COVID then, that way people spoke about COVID and the shame and all of that. The sense of, I have infected you, you have infected me, all of these fears. And one of the deep intelligences that you see in religious text is how it is that for millennia, this certain sense of taint has happened. Have I been sitting with somebody who has an opinion that is now deemed to be distasteful? How am I judged by association with them? How did I distance myself from them? What if it's me? How do I distance myself from me? If I find myself in these ways? I've worked for years in mediation trying to bring senior religious figures in the north of Ireland into hopefully something kinder in talking about lesbian and gay, bisexual, trans and intersex people. And one time somebody saw me out with a very conservative person having a cup of coffee and went back and said, God, I'm not sure we can trust Padraig because I just saw him having a cup of coffee with that fella. So suddenly I was being judged by taint. And so it's a powerful question about how association is tainting or association is affirming. I'm cool because you saw me out with that person, the way, and that too is a performance. And so the touch of a friend is not dependent on their cleanliness, and need and bleed and actions and shame. For me, all of those things are an exploration about how can we live from a raw essentialism of I need something like community, rather than commodifying whoever it is that we're with into a sense of proving my purity through whether I distance myself from them or come closer.
Well, and I don't know if you intended it, but by putting friend in there, among touching we know Jesus went out and touched the untouchables, right? That's part of his ministry. You don't need to stay there. For me, Judas entered. So he was betrayed with a kiss, with a touch, with an intimate touch. And it brought those two vulnerabilities into collision there. Yeah. I think I tend to my perfect superpower Jesus. He wasn't going to get leprosy. He's going to be fine. No, he was risking. Yeah. He was risking. And all the way to the end to have that. I've never had those two touches brought together in the gospel story.
Yeah.
I want to hear from y'all, so I'm going to pause there, either of these two. What chilled you? No, maybe it's not a burning question. What chilled you? No, what? questions you all have on the text or on something else you've experienced? Elizabeth.
What do you mean by the rotting hand of God?
I have no idea. And I have taken that out so many times and it always goes back in. Yeah, I just liked the idea of the rotting. I like the adjective there, the rotting hand of God. Yeah, absolutely no idea. What do you think?
I commend anybody to go look up R.S. Thomas's poem, The Hand.
Yeah.
He was a Welsh priest. If you want to meditate on hands and God, it's fascinating. The hands making, and then just once, anyway. Yeah, it's wonderful. It's so vivid. Yeah.
I'm looking at Wild. The fourth line, you made up stories to waste time and to keep the fear away. I feel that if you put yourself in a wilderness, it is to face something. And if you're wasting time by telling stories to yourself, you are keeping the fear of that truth away. That's how I read that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you put yourself in a wilderness and also a wilderness is in you. You know, the nothing is present. You know, we are made up of so much space inside of us. Crumpled up and squashed up as our organs are, there's also space. There's space inside every cell. There's so much of each cell is filled with emptiness. And so much of each atom is filled with emptiness. So partly, yes. And at the same time, I know that, you know, you come away and say, you know, that time in the wilderness or that time of discernment was, you know, I did the work. But even in the middle of doing the work, you were bored, you slept, you went to the bathroom, you know, you did all these things, you wondered about this, you waited for somebody to phone, you know, you did all the other things, that the mundanity of things, making up stuff, is present even in a time of intensity. And so I don't pit those ideas against each other. I just put them alongside each other. Yeah.
The story making me think, too, of Ardell telling me, you know, a coping mechanism helps us cope. Yeah. So it only becomes a problem after. It's not a bad thing. So it's making up stories. Maybe it's got this moment. There may be a point after which I haven't asked the right questions to the stories. Or,
sure. Yeah, it gets you through.
J.R.R.
Tolkien said, escapism isn't such a bad thing if you find yourself in prison. So.
Yeah.
Well, I think at some point, sorry. I think initially you're clearing the air about making stories up, but then the second part is it that inspiration? Is that where creativity comes from?
Yeah. Good story.
I like the word incarnation that you brought up. And I noticed in the third stanza, you shift from past to present.
In which one?
You knew, and then all of a sudden you are beneath us. And
the Lamb of God. Yeah.
And so in terms of experience versus presentness, I like the way you shifted gears there with you are beneath us.
Yeah.
It always, if we sit back and reflect and reflect and reflect, and all of a sudden, pow.
Yeah, it turns that poem. So a sonnet is meant to have a volta in it, a turn. A volt is where we get the word revolting, revolver, revolving, revolution. And volta just means turn. And so sonnets can be anywhere from 11 to 17 lines long. It's only relatively recently where people are like, it has to be 14. So originally sonnets could be anywhere from 11 to 17, various rhyming structure, Petrarchan, Shakespearean, etc. But one of the consistencies that they have is that they have a turn. And the turn that you've just highlighted here is it goes from being about to. That's where the turn is kind of hidden. I'm interested in subtle turns, and the turn here is hidden in the way you've done it. That it is about him at that. You weren't that, you weren't that, you weren't that. And suddenly it turns then to speak to him. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I like the way you make God so relatable. That I can imagine God in almost every person that I see the way you describe him. And you also make yourself so very vulnerable, and yet you're not preachy about it. We can accept who you are and not wonder or try to make you change or anything. I just really like that openness.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
It's kind. I mean, I should say, and I'm not saying this to be evasive, that I have no agenda about God in anything I write. You know, I'm not trying to make God accessible or inaccessible. I'm just trying to say, here's some language about it that has been a power and affecting me. I would have no agenda that people should move further or closer to any religious practice based on anything I write. I have no interest in that. That's your decision, and my interest is your freedom and safety to do whatever you want, with freedom and creativity. So I don't write with any recruitment agenda or distancing agenda. But I've been given this language through culture and the time that I was born and all of that, and so therefore I want to play in the mud of it, and that interests me. Yeah.
So I had the pleasure of being with you on yesterday, and you've talked a lot about, you're not interested in a bored Jesus or bored God, right? The character of God. And so I actually have a kind of threefold question. The first question is, what current characters today, like in my mind, I think of, I'm always intrigued by the characters that I want to like, but then I don't like, and then I do like, and then and June Osborne in The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've watched the TV series.
Read the
It's
book,
such
yeah.
a character for me. I want to root for you. And then there's these parts of her that I'm like, and I begin to see myself, obviously, in all that. And I'm wondering if there's any current contemporary characters that you find very intriguing and compelling and that you kind of glean from. And then my other two questions to go along with that is, what do you think is lost when we don't see the complexity of Jesus? And what do you think is gained when we do?
Okay. So some contemporary characters. I just read Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. Who's read Olive Kitteridge? Olive, isn't she believable and extraordinary and the most lovable, unlikable character in contemporary literature? She's terrible. Mousy is the first word she utters in that. Her husband's got this new, really nice, quite shy assistant in the pharmacy, and he almost feels paternal to her. Her husband's heart is just turned to think, how can I help this 22-year-old graduate who's frightened of everything? She's frightened of the day, she's frightened of the night, and she's really intelligent. And Olive Kitteridge says, Mousy. That's the first thing she says in the whole book. And then she says, no girl with that colour hair should wear beige. And she walks off. And she is utterly unlikable. And by the end, you see her and you go, Olive Kitteridge is the wide world. Oh my God. So there's such compassion in the way Elizabeth Strout writes Olive Kitteridge. Frances McDormand plays her in a television adaptation that was done. And I watched one episode of the television adaptation and thought, this is so damn good, the book must be better. So I'm going to read the book. So it wasn't that the television adaptation was poor, it was so brilliant. I thought, what did this come from? So she's who I'm currently looking at. I don't want to be anything like Olive Kitteridge, but I can't stop thinking about her. And Elizabeth Strout is the writer. And what do I think is lost by not looking at Jesus? I think one of the things that's lost is yourself. Do you know, if you're looking at Jesus of Nazareth and thinking that he's so perfect and everything's ideal and everything's this and that and the other, where are you? Where would you want to say? When you think of people that you know, where sometimes you want to say to them, what the hell was happening? What were you thinking? Like, what was going on? Like, if you had to preface all of that by saying, I know you're perfect, I know you're the Son of God or the daughter of God, I know that you're the Savior of the world, and I know that you knew everything that you were going to be doing, that's not a friendship. That's something completely different. And so I'm interested, I think one of the things that's lost in a simplistic reading of anybody is yourself. And so the question is always how to hold space for yourself, not because you're perfect either, but to assert the individuation in order to be able to say what you want to or need to say, and therefore from that to listen to whatever comes back. And I think what is found in that is something interesting. I'm trying to think, there are so many stories where people have said interesting things to Jesus of Nazareth that I think would be fascinating. I used to be a school chaplain, and I used to lead young people in Ignatian meditation, where they'd take a walk in their mind and they'd meet Jesus of Nazareth and say whatever they wanted to say to him. Preparation for confirmation or after confirmation, those kinds of things. And I'd say to them as we were coming towards the end, look, we're going to be finishing in a minute. Just get ready to say goodbye to Jesus in whatever way you want, and then take 3 deep breaths and then come back to the room. And I'll ask you a few questions, so you don't have to answer any of them. And I always loved asking young people how they said goodbye to Jesus. One fellow once said, he looked at me and said, I'll probably see you again. I loved the probably. I'll probably see you again. I wondered if the kid had been watching Carlsberg ads on television, so looking at probably in that way. But I loved that. I was so drawn into it. And I said to one kid, what was he like? And she said, he was a bit like a therapist. And I said, what do they do? And she went, I don't know. And then she said, but I think they listen. And I loved that. And so there was something about the association of all of them. One young fella said he was wearing a tuxedo drinking a martini. I was like, okay, I'd follow him, you know. And another one said he was in a bubble and I was on the surface of the sun burning and nothing was hurting him. There you are, extraordinary, so many interesting things. And I think when people can feel free enough to be themselves, something unexpected occurs. That's what's at the other side of conflict resolution, is surprise and unfolding and wonder and things that happen where you don't know the outcome. Conflict is a very boring plot. I want to dominate you. I'm interested in something where the erotics can be present of co-creating. And I think in a religious environment, the absence of freedom means that there's a very predictable plot line, which I can often find has a lot of victims.
Well, there's too much more to talk about, so you're going to have to come back next year. Would you thank Padraig for his week with us with me? Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for your questions. Join us in church, and we've got a good preacher today.